Well, good morning. And I suppose the first question that anyone might ask today is, why would any politician in their right mind voluntarily enter the minefield that is the free speech debate? It is a legitimate question. My immediate motivation came from a senior political colleague of mine who told me that I should do so because, and I quote, it's the next real battle that the right has to win. I profoundly disagree. I believe it is a battle that every Democrat, irrespective of political viewpoint, needs to win. Depending on your analogy, free speech is either a bellwether that tells us about society's direction of travel in relation to wider human rights, or a canary in a coal mine that warns us about impending disaster. In the short time that I will have today, it will only be possible to scratch the surface of the debate, but I hope it will encourage more political figures to enter this most vital of political arenas, even as some regard it as the equivalent today of the circus maximus. For me, free speech is a basic human right, essential for the function of democracy and necessary to allow differing views to be accepted and evaluated in a pluralist society. It follows that any restrictions should be exceptional and determined by rigorous tests of necessity and proportionality. We currently find ourselves churned in the wake of one of the greatest periods of technological revolution. It is unsurprising that we find ourselves socially and intellectually destabilized to an extent, unsure when our equilibrium will be reestablished. When the printing press brought a similar upheaval in the mid-1400s, it was the producers who enjoyed the rapidly expanding freedom that came with the technical revolution. Today, it is consumers who have instantly bought producers themselves, able to produce copy without any of the restrictions of form, content, knowledge, or sensitivity that we've come to expect from our traditional media. In this period of turbulence, we must constantly question whether we are exaggerating the scale of our problems and whether this is in itself a symptom of our own disorientation in a period of unprecedented change on our way to a new steady state. And perhaps the next generation, those who will have grown up in the era where the technological advance is not revolution but the status quo, will be more at ease with the challenges it has brought us. On the 10th of December 1948, following the defeat of fascism in World War II, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted and proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the latest stop on a long timeline from Socrates to Magna Carta to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the First Amendment of the US Bill of Rights. The UN Declaration was further reinforced by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which came into force on the 23rd of March 1976. It states that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing or in print, in the form of art, or any other media of his choice, and the exercise of these rights carries with it special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary, A, for the respect of the rights and reputations of others, and B, for the protection of national security or public order or public health or morals. Why does all of this matter? It matters because we have a clear statement in international law that the freedom of expression of ideas and opinions is fundamental to both the individual and to wider society. It contributes to the full development of each individual and is a necessary precondition to the enjoyment of a wider set of rights, from freedom of assembly and association to freedom of the press. An effective democratic society depends on voters developing informed opinions from free and open debate between candidates and exercising their choices unhindered at the ballot box. Free speech is therefore a key tool in the ability to execute change and crucial for both social and economic development. Freedom of expression, especially a free press, is a means of underpinning other human rights through the ability to expose abuses and persecution. As Richard Sambrook, the Professor of Journalism and Director of the Centre for Journalism at Cardiff University, put it, and I quote, "Intellectual restriction is as serious as physical incarceration. Freedom to think and to speak is a basic human right. Anyone seeking to restrict it only does so in the name of seeking further power over individuals against their will. So, free speech is an indicator of other freedoms." Free speech is also a means of ensuring that marginalized minority voices are heard, voices that might otherwise be drowned out. And it is a crucial bulwark against abuses of power, providing criticism of those who would use authority to restrict the freedom of others. Of course, there have always been accepted restrictions on absolute free speech, including libel and slander, obscene material such as child pornography, the abuse of copyrighted material, and speech directed towards imminent lawless action. These are key exemptions in the American First Amendment, an item that is often misunderstood and misused in the freedom of speech debate. In the short time available today, I would like to focus on three broad areas. The first is how, in the age of the internet and social media, we balance the right to free expression with the understanding that words can cause actual harm to others. The second is the current trend among some sections of society to extend their dislike of an expressed view on a particular topic to a demand that that view should not be heard at all, if necessary through bullying and intimidation. The third element is the often confused attempt by governments to restrict our freedom in the name of tolerance or the prevention of harm. Often, we might actually find the same people demanding tighter legislation to close down views and behaviour of which they disapprove, while simultaneously accusing politicians of restricting free speech if their own beliefs are criticised. This cognitive dissonance, as it's known in psychology, is yet another obstacle that we have to overcome in our considerations. So let me briefly turn to each issue in turn. The technical revolution has brought the rise of the internet and the proliferation of social media. They are unprecedented opportunities, but also new and often unforeseen problems. The American Pew Research Center has studied and reported on online harassment for a number of years. They've used 6 distinct parameters of behavior to objectively measure the problem. They are offensive name-calling, purposeful embarrassment, stalking, physical threats, harassment over a sustained period of time, and sexual harassment. The first 2 elements are categorized as less severe and the latter 4 as more severe. And evidence suggests that online harassment has intensified since 2017, with a growing number of Americans reporting the more severe forms of harassment and an increasing tendency for politics to play a part in the motive for such actions. In November 2019, in the UK, the Alan Turing Institute published a report which set out to quantify how much online abuse actually exists here. While they concluded that the prevalence of illegal online abuse in the UK is low, there were worrying patterns emerging across demographics. Black people and those of other ethnicities were more likely to be exposed to online abuse than white or Asian people. Younger people were likely to be more targeted by and exposed to online abuse, although this is likely, I think common sense tells us, to be partly from their greater use of internet and social media. Interestingly, the study did not identify a substantial difference according to gender, although this has been more apparent in other studies. And what effects can all of this produce? Well, a 2018 Swansea University study showed that self-harm and suicidal behaviour was twice as likely among children or young people under 25 who were victims of cyberbullying
Interestingly, and I think just as disturbing, was evidence that the perpetrators themselves were also at higher risk of suicidal thoughts and behavior. So there's no doubt in my mind that a serious problem exists. The issue is how best to address it. Perhaps, inevitably, there's been a demand for new legislation. Maybe that's a path that we will go down. But before we do, we must think very carefully about the possibility of unintended consequences. It will be crucial for us to have strict definitions and understanding of the concept of harm itself. There's no doubt that words can be harmful, but this is conceptually different from ideas of hurt or offence, where harm is generally taken as an injury inflicted on purpose. It's one of the most difficult and most sensitive areas of the debate around online regulation, but we will have to very carefully balance any concept of harm to the individual against harm that might be inflicted on the well-being of society in general by any restriction on liberty in our response. Balance, nuance, and proportionality will be key. Part of our approach should include the concept of digital self-care in order to improve resilience. This includes, for example, controlling online time and sites visited, limiting push notifications, managing apps, and resisting the need to record every step, every person met, and every bite taken. There must also be a role for parents and teachers in education about bullying, and, if necessary, intervention, including helping young people to intervene on behalf of those being victimized online. It cannot simply be an issue for the state to deal with. Another difficulty in the online era is that of libel and defamation. While a newspaper will be able to make a conscious decision about what appears in print, an online platform has less control. We cannot allow a disparity to emerge between the two, which would have our newspapers operating under much stricter laws than their digital counterparts. Of course, we could abolish the entire notion of libel entirely and move to a completely laissez-faire society whose consequences I don't actually care to imagine. But one solution which I find attractive is that where a judge would rule that a libel would have been committed in print, an order could be given to a digital platform to release the identity of the individual concerned, rather than ruling against the digital platform itself, thus maintaining the link between actions and consequences for an individual. Through all this debate, we must keep central in our minds the fact that in a free society, there is no such thing as a right not to be offended. The second problem I would like to consider amounts to nothing less than a growing form of censorship. It's associated with what many people today call the woke movement, but I actually believe it's more deeply rooted in a loss of objectivity that's become increasingly prevalent in recent times. The view often taken is as follows. It says, I have a right to say what I believe because I believe it to be right. You are not allowed to disagree with me because my view is right, and you will offend me if you criticize it. It goes further then and says, you, on the other hand, are not allowed to express your view simply because you believe it to be right, and if you do, I should be allowed to criticize it, even if it offends you. This is a concept of freedom of speech that belongs in a parallel universe. If unchecked, such a viewpoint will poison the body politic and choke the essential tolerance of a civilized society. It will lead to disintegration where majority intolerance and minority oppression become the norm. It represents a self-righteousness that has lost any concept of self-awareness or social context, and it provides a very real danger of igniting a counter-reaction, leading to majority intolerance and minority oppression. We saw a brutal example of this tendency in the sort of treatment handed out to J.K. Rowling following her Twitter remarks on transgender issues. While assessments of the volume of the response must be kept within the context of the world of the Twitter sphere, the vicious, extremely aggressive, and sometimes threatening language has a clear message. It is that the writer herself is not entitled to post her views because of her background, or as one critic put it, because, quote, her cis identity and its majoritarian privileges are overwhelming. The sinister part to me was not that it was a counterattack or riposte to the views she had posted, but an attempt to delegitimize her and thus her intervention. All of us, from whatever part of the political spectrum, must unite in making it abundantly clear that she is absolutely entitled to her views and to express them. Otherwise, what are these declarations of the right of free expression actually worth in international law? But I think we probably need to go further. We must all be willing to defend, in a practical way, those who we can see being intimidated by the online bullies. Keeping our heads below the parapet can only result in more victims, the trampling of our own values, and one person fewer in the defensive line between ourselves and the mob. And I must confess that I still feel guilty about not defending Jo Brand, with whom I have very vastly differing political views, when she was subject to an attack over a joke. And I do wish I'd spoken out in defense of Davina McCall when she made perfectly reasonable comments about not stigmatizing all men as being potentially threatening. We all have to accept our responsibility for where we are today and how we should respond in future. Another much discussed form of censorship is the recent rise of no platforming in, of all places, our universities. The very places where robust debate should reign supreme and where prejudice should be put to the sword of reason. Those who practice no platforming are not just delivering censorship and intolerance, but exhibiting intellectual cowardice. As Professor Chris Frost, the former head of journalism at Liverpool John Moores University, put it, and I quote, "Those who fear taking on opposing ideas and seek to silence or no platform should consider that it's their ideas that may be wrong. If someone's views or policies are that appalling, they need to be challenged in public for fear that they will, as a prejudice, capture support for lack of challenge." He spoke of the fascism of those who sought to restrict the expression of views they did not like, when he said, "Whether it is through violence or the abuse of power, such as no platform, we should always fear those who seek to close down debate and impose their view right or wrong. They are the tyrants." In a recent article in the Atlantic magazine by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, they raised a frightening spectre. In this article, they asked, has a set of new ideas on campus taught students to see oppression and violence wherever they look? If students are repeatedly told that numerical disparities are proof of systemic discrimination, and a clumsy or insensitive question is an act of aggression, and words are sometimes acts of violence that will shorten your life, then it begins to make sense that they should worry about their safety chronically, even within some of America's most welcoming and protective institutions. The rise of intolerance, the cancel culture, and the placing of emotional safety over intellectual rigor and free speech, particularly in our universities here in the United Kingdom, is a terrible indictment in a country that was at the heart of the global Enlightenment, and it brings shame to many parts of our academia. It's a great pity that government measures have had to be threatened to restore our most basic values to British academic life. They must put their house in order as a matter of urgency. Our third type of problem is the typically botched legislative efforts which restrict liberty in the name of tolerance and preventing harm, and it's typified by the recent Scottish Government's Hate Speech Act. This piece of legislation, which was ostensibly about tidying up the law in this area, managed to pull off the great political trick of uniting the Catholic Church and the National Secular Society, who warned that offences created by the bill will have a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Scots could now be subject to prosecution if their speech is deemed threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. Far from tidying up the law, the Scottish Government has actually extended the law's reach. Much of the old legislation was drawn from the Public Order Act 1986. But that law included an exemption for words and actions inside a dwelling, someone's home, that was not witnessed in public. This exemption has now disappeared, leaving Scotland, which led the Enlightenment and the quest for intellectual freedom, more restricted than other parts of the United Kingdom when it comes to freedom of speech. Attempts to introduce a dwelling defence to prevent what has been described as the risk of prosecution over the dinner table was rejected by the Scottish Government, claiming that such a defence would draw an entirely artificial distinction that would allow threatening and abusive bigotry simply because it was inside the home. It's interesting to imagine how the Scottish police force, tackling the highest drug death rates in Europe, will feel about the potential tsunami of complaints they will get from people who perceive offence from their neighbours and can now take action legally on the grounds of stirring up hatred. Of course, in the case of the Scottish Government, this is not an excursion without precedent. In 2012, they passed the Official Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Act, designed primarily to deal with groups with a perceived religious affiliation. Failing to achieve its original purpose, it was repealed in March 2018. So how should we deal with what some describe as the crisis in free speech? Let me make just 5 brief suggestions. First, we need to maintain a sense of perspective. We're still in the early years of the technological revolution in communications, and it's likely that we will take some time to reach a new equilibrium. We need to see the debate in the context of its wider long-term implications. Human Rights Watch put it succinctly when they said, access to information and free expressions are 2 sides of the same coin, and both have found tremendous accelerators in the internet and other forms of digital communication. Second, we must recognize that the challenges we face are not new, though they may manifest themselves in new forms. A proper historical context may help us navigate our contemporary problems. The general idea that free speech should be tolerated because it will lead towards the truth has a long history. John Milton suggested that restricting speech was not necessary because in a free and open encounter, he said, truth would prevail. President Thomas Jefferson argued that it's safe to tolerate error of opinion where reason is left free to combat it. The concept of the marketplace of ideas refers to the test that the test of the truth or acceptance of ideas depends on the competition with one another and not on the opinion of arbitrary judgment. The concept holds that what is factually true and morally good will win through in open discourse. Or as Peter Tatchell, the human rights activist, recently put it, bad ideas are most effectively defeated by good ideas, backed up by ethics and reason, rather than by bans and censorship. Third, we must steadfastly defend the rights of others to hold legitimate views against the vengeance of the online mob, standing up to the bullying of those intolerant of views other than their own, and pushing back against the delegitimizing of those whose opinions they dislike. Whether we agree with their views or not, we must defend their right to disagree. And when it's uncomfortable for us to make a stand, we should remember that we may need others to make a stand for us. When in 1859 John Stuart Mill published On Liberty, he set out a definition of the liberty of thought and discussion through 4 distinct grounds. And I think it's worth putting them in today's context. Rewritten, they might be represented as, first, silencing someone else's opinion because you believe you are right is unlikely to be a true assumption. Secondly, the conventional wisdom is seldom the whole truth. Alternative views are required to establish this. Thirdly, even if a stated view is the whole truth, it's unlikely to be accepted as such if no challenge to its veracity is allowed. And so fourthly, this could lead to the enfeeblement of the truth itself. In other words, the ability to challenge opinions is essential to ensure the triumph of objectivity over prejudice. So before you want to silence someone else, think through the implications of your actions and be careful what you wish for. Those groups today who wish to silence those who take contrary views to their own may find that they have set a precedent for their own silencing at a later date. Fourth, free speech is everybody's business, whether it's online abuse, the bullying mob of the intolerant, the cancel culture, no platforming, or unwanted government intervention. It's up to all of us to speak out in defense of those on the receiving end, whether we find the prospect comfortable or not. The greater our tendency to turn the other way, the greater the challenge that we may have to meet ourselves in the future, and the fewer allies we may have on our side as a consequence. Fifth, and finally, we should remember that our institutions are sound and strong, even when the courage of sections of our media, business, and political life is lacking. The recent decision by Lord Justice Bean and Mr. Justice Warby, presiding over a case in the Court of Appeal, sets a strong precedent, making it clear that in our society, there is no right not to be offended. They said, "Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. Free speech encompasses the right to offend and indeed to abuse another." Freedom of speech and freedom of expression have always had parameters set for their operation by convention or by law. Sometimes they have been shaped, perhaps unavoidably, in an arbitrary way, influenced by the culture of the times. Yet, an adherence to simple basic principles has provided us with the guidance that has allowed freedom and liberty to flourish. The judgments that we continue to have to make around the boundaries of free speech will continue to be sensitive and nuanced. But if we have to err, then we should err at all times on the side of freedom. After all, it is that freedom that enables us to have this debate at all. Thank you.
Thank you for your patience as we adjusted our setting. I'm Jodie Ginsberg. I'm the Chief Executive of Internews Europe. I'm a journalist and a free speech campaigner, and it's really exciting to have this opportunity to talk to you about my favourite subject today, Liam. I want to start by asking you about some of the expressions that we heard in the speech. So you talked about cancel culture. I noticed that in some of the coverage ahead of your speech today, it was described as a speech that would be taking on woke cancel culture. We hear people described as snowflakes and so on. Given that the thrust of your speech is about seeing this debate not as one of being on the right, how helpful do you think that kind of terminology is in really situating this as a debate for everyone to get engaged in?
Well, in giving a speech of this nature, obviously you think about where coverage will come from. I'm not a betting man, as I think I've said to you before, but if I were a betting man, I would have said that the centre-left newspapers will all cover the online abuse section of this speech, and the centre-right papers will all cover the woke no platforming. And I think that in itself is indicative of part of the problem that we have, which is that there's a polarization in our politics, which tends to put the political perspective ahead of the point of principle that we're discussing. And the reason that I've spent time concentrating on some of those different demographics, for example, in the online hate, was that we need to see the problem in the round, because simply choosing which elements of it we want to concentrate on, ignoring the rest, rather defeats the purpose. And I think that the point I made at the beginning, rather flippantly perhaps, that I was urged to do this because it was a battle that the right needed to win, is a very serious point, and actually was genuinely my motivation for this particular intervention, because we have to see it out with our normal political debate. There has been an increasing confusion between your dislike of a view or your strongly held view and the right to express it. And we've got to be able to isolate this concept that you are free to express your views within the confine of the law, irrespective of whether other people like it or not, from whichever end of that political spectrum you come. And I think it's essential, and I think it's actually a duty of politicians, journalists as well, to make that case, that we've got to not conflate the two.
And how damaging do you think it is to the cause of free speech, if you like, that it has increasingly perhaps become associated with views of those on the right?
I think that's only partly true. And so I think that a lot of these issues around wanting to restrict online speech are on the right, associated with the left. So I think that there's a dynamic in that debate, and I think that we should be analysing and teasing out both of those cases to see is there a problem? And I think it back to my time as a doctor, which was first of all, is the patient unwell? What is the differential diagnosis? What are the symptoms that lead us? And then what are the investigations that tell you what the actual issue is? Much the same process needs to be applied to this debate. And so the question is there a problem with freedom of expression and the internet and social media? And if there's an issue, does it have to be dealt with? And if it does have to be dealt with, how do we deal with it? And I think the same on the other side, on the so-called, I don't really like the term, the woke movement, but just let's use it as a shorthand because that's what is being used. Is it actually a problem? If it's a problem, is it a problem with free speech? If it's a problem, how does it need to be dealt with and how can we do it? So I think we do need to be much more objective about how we look at each of those areas of the debate.
I want to come on in a little while to how you might build that political consensus, but I want to dig into something that you said in the speech where you talked about accepting that words can cause actual harm. Because that to me seems one of the great challenges in the defense of free speech, is that understanding that words can cause actual harm and therefore what can you do about that? And you talked about some of your concerns about particular individuals expressing their viewpoints and being shouted down for doing that, or indeed no platformed. And I wondered how you would answer the challenge that, for example, you mentioned J.K. Rowling, that what she said was not simply her expressing her views, but the views she expressed caused actual harm, the kind of actual harm that you were talking about, and therefore it is legitimate to want her to be silenced or want those views to be silenced because the views themselves cause actual harm. How would you counter that? Well,
as I said, I think you have to see it in the round. First of all, I think that there's a reason why harm, hurt, and innocence are offence are three different words in the English language. If they all meant the same, they would all be the same word. And in law, we tend to think of harm as something that is purposely inflicted. So if J.K. Rowling caused offence, did she cause harm? In other words, did she intend that to be the case? I doubt that very much. Even if she did she act within the law? In which case she's entitled to do so. And on the question of harm, we know that in conversation, we all know with the conversation we have with people every day, what may be hurtful to one person may bounce off another. And certainly in public life, you have to get used to a sort of level of abuse that wouldn't be tolerated by most citizens, but that comes with the territory, and you develop a thick skin, as Betty Boothroyd once said. Broad shoulders and a thick skin were two prerequisites for being in public life. Um, so I think first of all, the first thing is that you have to, if you're looking at redress, in producing what might be a redress for an individual, is there a wider harm that you're causing to society by restricting its freedom of expression? And I think that's a very important debate. And I think that you can't therefore look at the concept of harm, even if you're looking at harm, as I defined it, in only one context, in only one part of the spectrum. You have to look at it as the whole. But also, what are we doing to improve the resilience of people to that? I mean, it takes us sort of into this debate that worries me hugely in our universities about so-called safe spaces. I need a safe space or I might be harmed. Well, you know, you cannot live life in a bubble. And I think our universities are about trying to teach reason over prejudice. And this sort of social or cultural, I don't know how to, I wouldn't say cultural apartheid, but you know what I mean by the separation from issues that you don't want to confront. It's not how you can live life, and certainly in our universities, that's not something we should be experiencing.
But you can understand the argument of people who would say, it is the job of the government, it is the job of my university, for example, to protect me from certain kinds of harm, whether you intend that harm or not. So if you are subjected on a daily basis to homophobic speech or racist speech, for example, is it not the job of the government or universities to protect you from that speech, whether the intention from the person who uttered it was to harm you or not?
It's the duty of the government to enforce the law. It's the duty of your university to operate within the law. I'm not sure that it's the duty of a university to stop students being challenged by views that they don't like. The whole point of the rigor of academic education is for you to be able to develop reasoned arguments against prejudice. That's one of the things that comes with that openness of debate. And you know, we've got to ridiculous levels recently when, you know, there's the army are not allowed to advertise at Freshers Week in a university for recruits because someone finds that offensive in relation to Britain's colonial history. I mean, you're getting to ridiculous levels at that. So I would say that did not remotely come into my concept of harm.
But you think that, for example, you might be able to differentiate between offensive speech and racist speech, for example, well, in terms of the specificity that you talk about, that laws must be specific. Do you think it's possible to construct law in such a way that could differentiate between racist speech and offensive speech, for example?
Well, we have laws that stop you inciting violence, for example. The law will change its nuance over time. It always does in reflecting the society that it's in. I wonder whether the pendulum's about to swing back in the other direction. I worry about that, frankly, if it goes too far. And that, as I was saying in my speech, I worry about the resentment at some of what are obviously ridiculous restrictions, igniting a backlash that goes the other way. And you know, this idea of cultural and social segregation at universities because you don't want to hear certain things is in many ways the very sort of social trends that the progressive left used to argue against, that we shouldn't have that sort of segregation. So I find that there's a lot of confusion in that debate. The law is always a compromise in many ways because of the way it's drafted in Parliament. And we're obviously going to have, in the very near future, some fairly robust arguments about some of these areas. But I think that, do I think that it's the university's job to protect you from views that you don't want to hear? Absolutely not, I don't.
You mentioned in your speech cognitive dissonance, and I wanted to talk to you about cognitive dissonance around free speech in the government. So I think we're agreed that when you are looking to restrict freedom of expression, restrictions should be exceptional. Talked about the necessity for tests of necessity and proportionality. So I've got to ask you, in that case, how you see that the elements of the Police Crime Sentencing to the Courts Bill that deal with the rights of police to restrict protests that cause serious unease fulfill those criteria. When we've heard Labour talk about the threat that bill poses to freedom of expression, even Mark Wallace of Conservative Home talks about vague laws, which you've spoken about in this speech as being a threat to free expression. So why would you vote in favour of a bill that restricts free expression in that way?
Well, just technically up to now, we've had the second reading of a bill, which is about the general contents of the bill, including increased sentencing for violent acts and rape and so on. There's a huge amount in that bill that everyone would pretty much want to see. We'll get down to the nitty-gritty of some of these clauses when we get to the committee stage of the bill. And I think that will be an occasion, I hope we get plenty of time, for examining some of these nuances. If we go back to the international definitions that I mentioned at the beginning, it does talk about exemptions and responsibilities relating to free speech when it comes to public order or public health or national security, for example. The question will always be a subjective one about where you draw that. And I think in doing so, the government has got to try to find consistency, that it's not being guilty, as you say, of cognitive dissonance in comparing one bit of legislation with another. And that can be quite difficult.
You would probably agree that serious annoyance and serious unease do not meet those tests of proportionality or necessity or specificity that you would want to protect free expression, I imagine.
Yes, but and it does come into other areas. So someone who stands with a megaphone outside their local district councillor's house because they didn't like something that local council did and does it day and night, that causes disruption to neighbours, to children and so on. Where's the balance of rights there in terms of free expression? So you're always having to balance one off against the other. The question is, can you define in the law sufficiently rigorously that you don't actually inadvertently restrict legitimate rights? For example, what we've seen recently, people demanding the right to free expression during a pandemic, I'm not particularly sympathetic to, because I think the risk to the greater good is affected quite potentially badly by that, when there are other rights of protest, and we have a free parliament sitting during that situation. But that wouldn't pertain in other circumstances. So again, it's all of this debate needs to fall within this particular area of the debate, which is if we accept that freedom of free expression should be the rule, what are the areas where it's acceptable to curtail it and why?
Well, let's talk about the other area where I think there's a lot of concern, including indeed from the Adam Smith Institute, about vagueness, and that's in the upcoming online harms bill, renamed the Online Safety Bill, which again is seeking to deal with the harms that people see online, but in a way that would devolve an awful lot of power to private social media companies to decide how to deal with speech that is, and this is a quotation from the review, legal but harmful. Should we be devolving that kind of extremely vague but very wide-reaching power to private companies? And are you concerned about what that might mean for freedom of expression online?
I have a problem with the concept of harmful but legal. If the government thinks something is sufficiently harmful, then perhaps it should legislate. But if you're operating within the law, it's not for the government to say that some bits of the law, some bits of that freedom are acceptable or unacceptable. That's where I think that the line is drawn at that legislation. Of course, for many years, and we would have regarded a kind of self-censorship of what we used to call good manners, is that we simply wouldn't have said certain things. And there have been some very interesting articles that suggest that what we're seeing today is not more abuse of speech, but just more speech. We're seeing more of it because of online than we would have seen before when it was limited to the printed page and so on, and that we might be overreacting to that. So the first question is there a real problem? So I think therefore quantifying it is essential before we take any action. And having quantified it, is it something we need to deal with? And if we need to deal with it, how? So I think those are the questions that I would want to apply to the online harms legislation as it comes forward. I think part of the reason for the delay is that it's a very difficult subject for government to deal with. There's so much subjectivity in that debate. And
Well,
it may produce some fairly rigorous debates in the House of Commons.
In the many years that I have been discussing this particular issue, I don't think I've yet to hear a government minister or a department accurately define harm in a way that we could deem to be proportionate. So I look forward to someone being able to do that if possible.
So something we have in common.
I want to ask you about a free press. It's something that you mentioned the importance of in your speech. We know that the government has a new national action plan for journalists. It talks about journalist safety, and yet we have organisations like the National Union of Journalists warning government ministers, I think most recently Jacob Rees-Mogg, not to engage in demeaning and slurs against journalists. We had the Equalities Minister earlier this year call a journalist creepy and bizarre for asking what seemed to me utterly legitimate questions at a journalist. I think you tweeted that at the Equalities Minister's tweet. Do you think that politicians have their own house in order when it comes to promoting a free press?
Well, to be fair, I think it's a bit rich for journalists to complain about politicians calling them weird or creepy, given the adjectives that are often thrown at politicians. The question is it good taste? Is it appropriate behaviour? Is a different question from is it legal and is it allowed within free expression? My own view is that we should restrict the number of adjectives we use in descriptions of people anyway. Stick to the issues. Again, I think there's this conflation between the individual's identity and their ability to express what they want. So there's no more reason to restrict someone's or to oppose someone's views because they're a journalist any more than because they're a politician. It's not something that I would do, and I think
there's a difference between criticising someone because you don't like their personality and criticising the actions that they take as worthy of a name or creepy and bizarre, because that brings, I work with journalists in hundreds of countries around the world, and I can tell you that every time a politician engages in that kind of language about the profession, it has a knock-on effect in diminishing trust in the media, which is, I think we would agree, a vital pillar of democracy. So
I think one of the disciplines that politicians should apply to themselves is always play the ball, don't play the man. It's a good discipline to stick to. And whenever I hear people attacking me, primarily for being me, and secondarily because of the views I have, I think, well, why would they try to delegitimize my view by attacking me first? Because that's what that process actually is. So we should have the discipline, I think, and the professionalism to deal with the view. Let's counter the view first. I think that the sort of process that you are mentioning isn't that different from the example I gave about J.K. Rowling, where people trying to delegitimize her and thereby delegitimizing her view. It's a tendency which I think has become more prevalent, but is extremely unpleasant and unhealthy.
You mentioned in the speech.
I'm not saying we all do it. I mean,
yeah.
We do it to some degree or another, so I'm not exempting myself from that. I'm just thinking that we should be more conscious of it. And because it's becoming a more common trend, we should be all the more aware that we're not playing that particular game.
And part of the kind of getting used to how to behave on social media that you talked about. You mentioned in the speech a couple of people that you wished you had spoken out when you saw that they were being subjected to social media violence. And I hear you talk about Joe Brown, whose politics you disagree with. Are there individuals that you can think of whose viewpoints, who said things specifically that you personally have disagreed with or even found offensive that you would have wanted to or would want to support publicly? Or at least support their rights to have said that thing publicly?
Yes, in preparation for this speech, that's a question I've been asking myself more and more. Should we, and as I was suggesting today, should we consciously be out saying, I disagree with this view, but I defend their right to say it? For many of us, that's almost self-evident, but maybe we're now in a period where it isn't self-evident to enough people, and we need to actually make that. And it's something I'm going to think about, because you know, there are times when you don't do things and you know deep down that you should have done it. The Joe Brand thing for me was one of them. It was about contextualizing it. You know deep down that you should have done it, and it little exactly the fact that you didn't. And it's something that I'm aware of. I'm also very aware of the temptation, just when someone says something you really dislike on social media, to immediately hit back. And I think that's also something that we should do. I mean, I'm a great believer that don't do anything in anger anyway. It's usually your poorest point of judgment. And it's too easy to do it. Well, we have in my office staff standing off to my left here, we have a mechanism where I can't do that, not without them giving their agreement to going online. So you can put controls in place.
I'm curious to know whether you think that's possible also in Parliament itself. I mean, last week we heard a couple of female politicians raising the issues of violence against women and told to speak in more temperate language. It certainly made me feel slightly intemperate at them being told to be temperate. Is that the kind of environment in which, if you had that sort of thing, you would be able to criticise it, that kind of language publicly or not?
Well, I think there's a difference between not liking the language or feeling that it's intemperate and stopping it from happening. So again, I would draw the line there. Parliament, of course, is a unique place because we carry privilege. We have the ability to say things that are not said elsewhere. So it's something that we should all be very careful about how we exercise. But in Parliament, of all places, you should be free to say what you want. We are there, therefore, we're there because we are representing views of our constituents of a range of on the political spectrum. So we, of course, have our own rules in Parliament about what words you can say and what you can't say. So we have privilege underwritten by the Bill of Rights, but you couldn't say drunk and you couldn't say liar inside the House of Commons. So they're self-imposed restrictions.
But I guess what I'm saying is, in this kind of call-outs, these call-out mechanisms that you're talking about, if you heard a colleague say something to a colleague on the other side of the political spectrum that you felt was demeaning or diminishing or indeed discouraging that person from speaking out, do you feel that that's something that you would now feel confident in?
Oh, I think it's something that I would very likely have anyway said. I think you should watch the tone of what you say. Again, I mean, you can't legislate for tone. There are limits, and so legislation does so much, but we have, a lot of the social mores that we have are the ways in which we regulate how we express ourselves to one another. But I do think in the House of Commons, as I said, we have our self-censorship in certain words. But that's a long-standing convention. But our ability to say things is not limited.
So I want to turn back before we close to this question about how we can build cross-party, cross-political consensus around the areas of free speech. You will know something that I have talked about often is my concern that free speech gets owned by one political side or the other and ceases to be seen as a universal freedom or a universal right. Have you thought, as you were beginning this journey and challenging your colleagues, how you want to start to build consensus? Are there practical things that you can do to start to build this broader group of support for freedom of expression?
So I think first is self-awareness. It's actually understanding what the rules that we set ourselves. We're not always going to follow them. None of us will always do that, but be more aware of them. I think that education's got a role to play in this. We've got a generation that's growing up with a totally different set of communication tools than we had when we were growing up. And I think that a lot of that has a role in education to be undertaken there. I mean, I mentioned about parents and teachers and bullying, for example, pointing out that these things may not be illegal to say, but going back to your earlier argument, they may be hurtful and offensive, and maybe you should avoid saying them for that reason. I think that we do need to look at the way that we all have this political discourse. And I think if I were to take one thing, it's to go back to that example I gave. The one rule we should have is always play the ball, don't play the man. deal with the arguments of your opponents, not your opponents. And frankly, when I see people attacking their opponent before they attack their views, it makes me wonder how confident they are in actually taking those views on and trying to get to that concept of tolerance with objectivity, I think is key.
Can I ask, as a final question, one of the things that strikes me is whenever we come to these discussions, people always call for more legislation. There is a problem, there must be more law. And whenever I go into some of these select committees or talk to politicians, there seems to be a mixed understanding of what law we already have to protect us from harmful speech. Do you think there's more that could be done to help Parliament, politicians understand the laws that we already have? And is there a way in which you can help Parliament bring a sort of greater free expression lens to some of this legislation before it gets as far as it sometimes does?
Well, no, this is the bit we usually tend to fade a little bit, one of these questions, but it seems to me that in Parliament and politics, there are two easy answers to any problem you're faced with. One, legislate it. Number two, throw money at it. They seldom result in the result that you want. The problem with legislation is that it's very easy to fall into that law of unintended consequences, and that the political landscape is littered with victims of that. In trying genuinely and legitimately to deal with a grievance, it is quite easy to create a law that creates further and different problems further down the line. That will be the problem with the online safety bill when it comes. And I think because bringing about cultural and societal change is much harder, it can be the easy option to say, let's legislate. I'm not a great fan of more legislation. I'm actually a great believer that we could be repealing a lot of our legislation that we have. But then being a small state conservative is not the most fashionable thing at the present time. But then things change.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It was great to chat to you.